Every man who walked the perimeter of that pile in the fall of 2011 came away with the same opinion. It smelled like something between a compost heap and a wet barn floor, which it basically was. The mound ran the length of a football field along the back fence of Loretta Guidry's 31 acres in St. Mary Parish, Louisiana. And it had been building there, one truckload at a time, for going on 9 years. Crushed sugarcane stalks. Bagasse, the industry calls it. Wet, fibrous, matted gray-brown, and good for nothing as far as the parish extension agent could tell, and he'd been asked about it. More than once. The sugar mill 4 miles east had been dumping it under an informal agreement that had never been written down and was, legally speaking, hard to call an agreement at all. Loretta had inherited the arrangement along with the property when her father died. The pile just kept coming. Neighbors called it an eyesore. The man who leased her back pasture for grazing had asked her twice if she planned to have it hauled off. She said she was thinking on it. She said that for 3 years running. What she was actually doing was watching. Stories like this don't get told much anymore. If you grew up around people who worked with their hands and didn't say much about it, hit subscribe before we go any further. We're going to keep telling them as long as you keep watching. St. Mary Parish sits in the southern tier of Louisiana, below I-10, in country that is flat and wet and green most of the year. The sugarcane fields there come right up to the road shoulders, and in October when the harvest runs, the mills work around the clock and the air smells like scorched sugar and diesel. Loretta Guidry's family had farmed 31 acres there since her grandfather bought it in 1961 for $4,800, which was more than he could afford at the time, and which he paid off in 11 years by raising cattle and growing a small market garden. By 2011, Loretta was 53 years old and working as a bookkeeper for a feed distributor in Franklin, 40 minutes each way. Her husband Dale ran a small diesel repair shop. They had 2 children, both grown and gone to Baton Rouge. The 31 acres had not been a working farm in any serious sense since her father's health had gone out from under him in 2006. She leased the front pasture to a neighbor named Thibodeau, who ran a small Brangus cow-calf operation. The back 40% of the property, the part behind the bayou drainage, was where the mill had been depositing bagasse since 2002, under a handshake arrangement her father had agreed to in exchange for the mill grading his access road. The pile in October of 2011 covered approximately 2 acres and stood, at its tallest point, about 8 feet high. It contained, Loretta had calculated this herself, sitting at her kitchen table with a notepad one evening, somewhere between 2,400 and 3,000 tons of compacted cane fiber. The extension agent, when she'd called him the first time, had told her it was a nuisance and that she should look into whether the mill had proper permits for the dumping. He didn't sound confident that they did. He also said that bagasse composted poorly on its own due to its high silica content, and that it had limited agricultural value in raw form. He was not entirely wrong. He was also not entirely right. There was a man named Roland Arsenault who watched Loretta more carefully than most people knew. He was 71 in 2011, a retired LCU Ag Center soil specialist who had spent 38 years working agricultural problem cases across the southern parishes. He had been retired for 6 years by then and was spending his mornings walking his own small property, which abutted the Guidry fence line on the east side. He had seen the pile grow. He had also seen, 3 times in the past 2 years, Loretta standing out behind her fence in the late afternoon with what looked like a hand trowel, pushing material around in the outer edges of the pile. He didn't ask her what she was doing. He was the kind of man who waited for people to get around to asking their own questions. She knocked on his door the first Saturday of March 2012. She brought a mason jar of something she'd collected from the base of the pile, where it met the native soil. Dark, crumbly material. Different in texture from what was further up in the mound. She set it on his kitchen table and asked him what he thought. He put on his glasses. He turned the jar over. He smelled it. "You know what that looks like," he said. She said she had a guess. What she had was something better than a guess. She had been watching that pile decompose from the outside in for 2 years, tracking the color change at the margins, checking the heat at the interior. Bagasse in deep compost generates significant internal temperature, and testing the drainage in the soil around the base. She had taken photographs on a disposable camera and had them developed at the Walgreens in Morgan City. Dated and filed in a folder her daughter had given her one Christmas that said important papers on the tab. Roland Arsenault was a man who had spent nearly 4 decades watching farmers ignore what was right in front of them. Watching Loretta Guidry, he said later, was something different. She had already figured out most of it, he said. She just wanted to know if she was reading it right. What the jar showed, what the outer margins of that pile had been quietly producing for the better part of 3 years, was partially humified organic material. Not finished compost, not in the agronomic sense, but a substrate that, with the right carbon to nitrogen correction and inoculation, could be converted into a soil amendment product with a specific use case: low pH, phosphorus-depleted agricultural land, which described, to varying degrees, a substantial portion of the surrounding parish's vegetable and specialty crop ground. The pile was not a nuisance. The pile was inventory. This is what Loretta Guidry knew that the extension agent did not. Bagasse is chemically unusual. The silica that makes it compost slowly also makes it structurally stable, which means it holds its form in soil longer than conventional compost. For certain applications, raised vegetable beds, nursery substrate mixes, strawberry production in particular, that slow breakdown is not a deficiency. It is a feature. She had read about this in an El Sioux agricultural bulletin from 1997, which she had found in her father's files in a cardboard box under his workbench after he died. He had circled a paragraph in blue pen. She did not know why he had circled it. He was a cattleman and had no obvious reason to care about specialty crop substrates. She thought about that circle for a long time. Her father's name was Emile. He had farmed that 31 acres for 40 years and had kept a ledger, not a diary, a ledger with columns and line entries that tracked every decision he made on the property, what it cost, what it produced, what he would do differently. He wrote in it the way some men pray, regularly, without much expectation of immediate return. When he agreed to let the sugar mill dump bagasse behind his fence, he had written the date, the name of the mill foreman, the terms of the road grading, and then a single note in the margin. The note said, "Possible value." Investigate. He never did investigate. His health gave way before he got around to it. But he had seen something, or at least suspected something, the same way Loretta had seen something when she stood at the edge of that pile with a hand trowel in the late afternoon. Neither of them could have fully explained it. Sometimes a farmer looks at a thing other people are ignoring and simply knows, without being able to say exactly how, that the ignoring is a mistake. Roland Arsenault did not teach Loretta Guidry very much that she didn't already know in some form. What he gave her was the technical vocabulary to say it out loud, and the name of a woman at the El Sioux Ag Center in Baton Rouge who worked with small-scale amendment producers. That was enough. By the spring of 2013, Loretta had formed an LLC. She named it Emile's Ground, which her son said was corny and her daughter said was right, and had worked out an arrangement with a landscape supply company in New Iberia to test a small processed batch of the amended bagasse material on their nursery substrate line. Getting there had cost her $4,700 out of her own savings and 11 months of weekends. The processing setup was not complicated. A second-hand chipper shredder she found on Craigslist for $380 from a man in Breaux Bridge. A used Bobcat skid steer that Thibodeau let her run on weekends, and a simple windrow system she set up along the back fence line using field tile she borrowed from Roland Arsenault. She inoculated the windrows with a nitrogen-rich amendment, poultry litter, sourced from a broiler house in Iberia Parish to correct the carbon-to-nitrogen ratio, and she turned the rows on a schedule she had worked out herself after reading 2 university extension publications and a single peer-reviewed article she printed at the Franklin Public Library. The landscape company in New Iberia ran 2 test beds with the material in the summer of 2013. One was a container perennial operation. The other was a raised bed tomato trial. Both performed better than their control beds, not dramatically, not in a way that made anyone certain of anything, but better. Measurably, the landscape company's owner, a man named Breaux, who had been in the business for 22 years and had no particular reason to get excited about a woman from St. Mary Parish with a skid steer and a second-hand chipper, placed an order for 6 tons in October of 2013. 6 tons at $38 a ton was $228. Not a fortune. She did not pretend it was. She had 2 acres of inventory. The conversation with the mill came in January of 2014. Loretta had sent a letter to the mill manager, certified mail, return receipt requested, explaining that she intended to convert the bagasse stockpile into a commercial soil amendment product, and asking to formalize the delivery arrangement with a written agreement that specified tonnage, schedule, and her right to use and sell the material. She also, at the bottom of the letter, noted that she had spoken with the Parish Environmental Compliance Office and that the current informal dumping arrangement did not appear to have been properly permitted. She was not threatening anyone. That is an important thing to understand about how she wrote it. She was simply stating facts in their correct order. The mill sent a representative out 2 weeks later. His name was Fontenot. He sat in her kitchen and drank coffee and looked at the letter, which she had placed on the table face up. He said they hadn't intended any harm. She said she didn't think they had. He said the road grading had cost them something over the years. She said her father had appreciated it. There was a pause. She did not fill it. They signed a written agreement in February of 2014. The mill would continue delivering bagasse to the site, now documented and permitted, and would pay her $4 per ton for the material. She retained all rights to process and sell the end product. The mill got a legal, documented disposal arrangement that cleaned up their compliance situation. Loretta got paid for receiving a raw material she was already converting into inventory. She drove home from signing that paperwork and sat in her driveway for several minutes before going inside. She called Roland Arsenault and told him. He said he wasn't surprised. By 2017, Emil's Ground was supplying amended bagasse substrate material to 14 landscape and nursery operations across 4 South Louisiana parishes. Annual production was running at approximately 280 tons. Revenue for that year was $41,200. Not a primary income. Not yet. Dale's shop was still the household's main support. But the extension agent who had told her in 2009 that bagasse composted poorly and had limited agricultural value had called her office line twice in the past 18 months. The first time, he wanted to know what she was doing differently. The second time, he was asking on behalf of someone else who had a similar situation and wanted advice. She called him back each time. She explained what she could in a reasonable amount of time and gave him Roland Arsenault's phone number for the technical questions. She had also, by 2017, negotiated the mill delivery agreement to include a second site, a neighboring property whose owner had agreed to let her use a backfield as a secondary windrow yard in exchange for a percentage of the processed output. That arrangement expanded her annual incoming volume by approximately 40% and cost her no capital. She is 65 now. She and Dale retired 2 years ago. Emile's Ground is registered in Louisiana as a certified organic input producer, a designation that opened up a set of buyers, certified vegetable operations, specialty growers, who pay a different price scale than landscape supply accounts. The material now moves at $55 to $68 a ton depending on specification, and she processes somewhere between 400 and 450 tons per year. The pile behind the back fence is smaller than it used to be. Not gone. She keeps a working inventory. Roland Arsenault died in the spring of 2021. He was 80 years old. He had spent his last few years walking his property in the morning and, when the weather was right, standing at his fence watching Loretta's windrow rows turn from gray-brown to dark. The way things do when they are becoming something else. At the edge of the mound, if you stand close enough on a cool morning, you can feel the heat coming up from inside. Bagasse in deep process runs warm for months. Most people walk past that kind of heat and don't think much about it. Loretta's father thought about it once and wrote it down and didn't get to finish the thought. She finished it for him. That is the whole story. And that is how it is supposed to work.